Synopsis of the Books of the Bible. Matthew. By J.N. Darby. New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 22. The Marriage Feast. In Matthew 22, their conduct with respect to the invitations of grace is presented in its turn. The parable is, therefore, a similitude of the kingdom of heaven. The purpose of God is to honor his Son by celebrating his marriage. First of all, the Jews, already invited, are bidden to the marriage feast. They would not come. This was done during Christ's lifetime. Afterwards, all things being ready, he again sends forth messengers to induce them to come. This is the mission of the apostles to the nation when the work of redemption had been accomplished. They either despise the message or slay the messengers. See note. The result is the destruction of those wicked men and of their city. This is the destruction that fell upon Jerusalem. On their rejection of the invitation, the destitute, the Gentiles, those who were outside, are brought into the feast, and the wedding is furnished with guests. Another thing is now presented. It is true that we have seen the judgment of Jerusalem in this parable, but, as it is a similitude of the kingdom, we have the judgment of that which is within the kingdom also. There must be fitness for the occasion. For a wedding feast, there must be a wedding garment. If Christ is to be glorified, everything must be according to his glory. There may be an outward entrance into the kingdom, a profession of Christianity, but he who is not clothed with that which appertains to the feast will be cast out. We must be clothed with Christ himself. On the other hand, all is prepared, nothing is required. It was not the guest's part to bring anything, the king provided all. But we must be imbued with the spirit of that which is done. If there is any thought of what was suitable to a wedding feast, the need of a wedding garment to appear in would surely be felt. If not, the honor of the king's son has been forgotten. The heart was a stranger to it, the man himself shall become so by the judgment of the king when he takes cognizance of the guests who have come in. Note. Contempt and violence are the two forms of the rejection of the testimony of God, and of the true witness. They hate the one and love the other, or cleave to the one and despise the other. End of note. Thus also grace has been shown to Israel, and they are judged for refusing the invitation of the great king to the marriage of his son. And then the abuse of this grace by those who appear to accept it is also judged. The bringing in of the Gentiles is declared. Here concludes the history of the judgment of Israel in general, and of the character which the kingdom would assume. The Pharisees and Herodians answered. After this, Matthew 22 verse 15, 8 sec, the different classes of the Jews come forward, each in turn. First, the Pharisees and the Herodians, that is, those who favored the authority of the Romans, and those who were opposed to it, seek to entangle Jesus in his talk. The blessed Lord answers them with that perfect wisdom that ever displayed itself in all he said and all he did. On their part, it was pure wickedness manifesting a total want of conscience. It was their own sin that had brought them under the Roman yoke, a position contrary indeed to that which should have belonged to the people of God on earth. Apparently, therefore, Christ must either become an object of suspicion to the authorities or announce his claim to be the Messiah and consequently the deliverer. Who had occasioned this dilemma? It was the fruit of their own sins. The Lord shows them that they had themselves accepted the yoke. The money bore the mark of this. Let them render it then to those unto whom it belonged, and let them also, which they were not doing, render unto God the things that were God's. He leaves them under the yoke which they were obliged to confess they had accepted. He reminds them of the rights of God, which they had forgotten. Such might moreover have been Israel's state according to the establishment of power in Nebuchadnezzar, as a spreading vine of low stature. The unbelief of the Sadducees. The Sadducees come next before him, and question him as to the resurrection, thinking to prove its absurdity. Thus, as the condition of the nation had been exhibited in his discourse with the Pharisees, the unbelief of the Sadducees is displayed here. They thought only of the things of this world, seeking to deny the existence of another. But whatever the state of degradation and subjection into which the people had fallen, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, changed not. The promises made to the fathers remained sure, and the fathers were living to enjoy these promises hereafter. It was the word and the power of God which were in question. the Lord maintains them with power and evidence. The Sadducees were silenced. The essence of the perfect law. The lawyers, struck with his reply, ask a question, which gives the Lord occasion to extract from the whole law, that which, in the sight of God, is its essence, presenting thus its perfection, and that which, by whatever means it may be reached, forms the happiness of those that walk in it. Grace alone rises higher. Here their questioning ceases. All are judged, all is brought to light with respect to the position of the people, and the sects of Israel, and the Lord has laid before them the perfect thoughts of God respecting them, whether on the subject of their condition, of his promises or of the substance of the law. The Lord's question, its only answer. It was now the Lord's turn to propose his question in order to bring out his own position. He asks the Pharisees to reconcile the title of Son of David with that of Lord which David himself gave him, and that in connection with the ascension of this same Christ to sit at the right hand of God until God had made all his enemies his footstool, and established his throne in Zion. Now, this was the whole of Christ's position at that moment. They were unable to answer him, and no man durst ask him any more questions. In fact, to understand that psalm, would have been to understand all the ways of God with respect to his Son at the time they were going to reject him. This necessarily closed these discourses by showing the true position of Christ, who, although the Son of David, must ascend on high to receive the kingdom, and, while waiting for it, sit at the right hand of God according to the rights of his glorious person, David's Lord, as well as David's Son. The condition, privileges and responsibility of all classes of the Jews. There is another point of interest to be remarked here. In these interviews and these discourses with the different classes of the Jews, the Lord brings out the condition of the Jews on all sides with respect to their relations with God, and then the position which he took himself. He first shows their national position towards God, as under responsibility to him, according to natural conscience and the privileges belonging to them. The result would be their cutting off, and the bringing in of others into the Lord's vineyard. This is Matthew 21 verses 28 to 46. He then exhibits their condition with regard to the grace of the kingdom and the introduction of Gentile sinners. Here also the result is the cutting off and the destruction of the city. See note. Afterwards, the Herodians and the Pharisees, the friends of the Romans and their enemies, the pretended friends of God, bring out the true position of the Jews with respect to the imperial power of the Gentiles and to God. In his interview with the Sadducees, he shows the certainty of the promises made to the fathers and the relationship in which God stood to them in respect of life and resurrection. After this he puts the real meaning of the law before the scribes, and then the position which he took, himself the son of David, according to Psalm 110, which was linked with his rejection by the leaders of the nation who stood around him. Note. Observe here, that from Matthew 21 verse 28 to the end, we have the responsibility of the nation looked at as in possession of their original privileges, according to which they ought to have borne fruit. Not having done so, another is put in their place. This was not the cause of the judgment which was, and yet is in a more terrible way to be, executed on Jerusalem, and which even then accomplished the destruction of the city. The death of Jesus, the last of those who had been sent to look for fruit, brings judgment on his murderers. Matthew 21 verses 33 to 41. The destruction of Jerusalem is the consequence of the rejection of the testimony to the kingdom sent to call them in grace. In the first case, the judgment was upon the husbandmen, the scribes, and chief priests, and leaders of the people. The judgment executed on account of the rejection of the testimony to the kingdom goes much farther, see Matthew 22 verse 7. Some despise the message, others ill-treat the messengers, and, grace being thus rejected, the city is burned up, and its inhabitants cut off. Compare Matthew 23 verse 36, and see the historical prophecy in Luke 21. The distinction is maintained in all three Gospels. End of note.